I declare open the Legislative Council Economy and Infrastructure Committee's public hearing for the inquiry into land transfer fees. Please ensure that mobile phones have been switched to silent and that background noise is minimised. I would like to begin this hearing by respectfully acknowledging the Aboriginal peoples, the traditional custodians of the various lands we are gathered on today, and pay my respects to their ancestors, elders and families. I particularly welcome any elders or community members who are here today to impart their knowledge of this issue to the committee. I was going to welcome anyone watching via the live broadcast, but we're not broadcasting today. We've just been discussing that, and the video will be uploaded to the website after the fact. So we'll introduce ourselves as a committee before we kick off, starting with...
Evan Mulholland, Northern Metropolitan Region.
Catherine Copsey, Southern Metropolitan Region.
John Berger, Southern Metropolitan Region.
Georgie Purcell, Northern Victoria.
David Limbrick, South East Metro.
Bev MacArthur, Western Victoria Region.
Tom McIntosh, Eastern Victoria Region.
Thanks, Tom. All evidence taken is protected by parliamentary privilege as provided by the Constitution Act 1975 and further subject to the provisions of the Legislative Council standing orders. Therefore, the information you provide during the hearing is protected by law. You are protected against any action for what you say during this hearing, but if you go elsewhere and repeat the same things, those comments may not be protected by this privilege. Any deliberately false evidence or misleading of the committee may be considered a contempt of Parliament. All evidence is being recorded. You'll be provided with a proof version of the transcript following the hearing. Transcripts will ultimately be made public and posted on the committee's website. For the Hansard record, could you both please state your name and the organisation you're appearing on behalf of?
Jonathan O'Brien, YIMBY Melbourne.
Don Holloway, YIMBY Melbourne.
Great. Thanks for coming along today. So we'll get you to make your opening comments. We ask that you keep them to around 10-15 minutes max to ensure we have plenty of time for questions.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to speak today on the important issue of stamp duty reform in Victoria. A little about us, because we're obviously a relatively new organisation. YIMBY Melbourne is a grassroots member-based organisation advocating for housing abundance in Melbourne. We're active across local advocacy, policy and digital infrastructure, including active members across more than a dozen Melbourne councils. We advocate for meaningful densification and the expansion of housing supply to ease the current housing crisis faced by Victorians. We want to see Melbourne flourish into a city full of life, an opportunity where all are welcome, and we see access to abundant, affordable housing as a primary barrier preventing Melbourne from reaching its full potential as a city. Our submission to this inquiry focused on the effects of stamp duty on the supply of housing, and this remains our focus, but our unique position as a grassroots organisation is that we can advocate for the younger, aspirational demographic of Australians who want access to housing and have made all the quote-unquote correct moves, but they do not feel secure in where they live. They do not have that opportunity. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Don.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you, Chair. Imagine Olivia, who's done everything society told her to do. She went to uni, got a job, and after a few years' hard work, managed to buy a house in Melbourne. When an exciting new job comes up in Bendigo, Olivia needs to move, but in order to move, she will have to pay stamp duty again, or rent out the house in Melbourne while renting her new home in Bendigo. Olivia has just become a reluctant landlord in order to avoid paying another $30,000 to $40,000 in stamp duty, all because she has a more dynamic career that does not afford her the stability of staying put for longer periods of time. Meanwhile, Akil is in a similar position, but grew up and got a job in Sydney. He also bought a home. When he receives a job offer in Melbourne, he faces a similar choice to Olivia. To avoid renting where he does not want to, he would be forced to sell his house and buy again in Melbourne, once again paying stamp duty along the way. In this case, stamp duty is a literal disincentive from moving to Melbourne. If Victoria abolished stamp duty, moving from Sydney to Melbourne would be a much cheaper and easier affair for Akil. In fact, it would be easier than moving anywhere in New South Wales, giving Victoria a competitive advantage above other states in terms of our ability to attract talent. The YIMBY Melbourne membership is predominantly younger professionals who see a housing market rigged against them. We know that today, young people have multiple careers where previous generations did not. We see this as fundamentally a good thing. Increased personal dynamism enables more flexibility in job markets and enables more productivity. But these people are not well served by the outdated system of stamp duty, which taxes people whose skills and career draw them to move within and beyond our state.
And it's not just young people who this negatively affects, of course. I can tell you the story of my grandmother, who currently lives on her own in a 4-bedroom house, and she's done so for many years. Now, she's a stubborn old woman, and I can say that because I think I have parliamentary privilege. So there are many reasons why she might not want to move. But one of them is absolutely the imposition of stamp duty. This is a woman who grew up during harder times and who worries about the resources she has. In simple terms, when she thinks about moving, she thinks about what she'll lose. And an additional loss, the imposition of stamp duty, is a part of what keeps her from moving. This is not a moral position on taxation. In fact, land tax, for which we advocate in our submission, sometimes gets derided as a grandmother tax because it functions as a new tax on those who have held property for a long time. But we see a tax like this, one that incentivizes rather than disincentivizes a better use of scarce resources such as land. We see these as good taxes. Any tax that on even the off chance might make a woman as stubborn as Irene O'Brien consider moving house, rather than staying put in her own 4 bedrooms on an acre block, is fundamentally a good tax. We have to use land better, and we have to enable our aging population to feel okay about moving and downsizing so that housing can be better allocated to those who need it most in the moment.
Families are also impacted by the negative effects of stamp duty. Another hypothetical. Felix and Stuart plan out their lives in detail, so when they decide to buy a house and settle down, they're thinking about their future housing needs, which include enough bedrooms for a boy and a girl. But for now, they're focusing on their careers, and Stuart is able to work from home. Their kids are still years away. Nevertheless, they purchase a 4-bedroom house when they only make use of 2 bedrooms. Within the current tax scheme, Felix and Stuart have made a reasonable decision since, by purchasing the house they anticipate they will need in the future, instead of buying what they need now, they avoid having to pay stamp duty a second time. But this means Felix and Stuart are consuming more housing than they will need for many years. The distortionary nature of stamp duty creates inefficient uses of housing supply all the time, and restricts the ability of other families to obtain the housing they need. On the other hand, the Gobiuses weren't planning on having any kids, so they purchased a small apartment in the inner city thinking it would be suitable for them long term. But as many couples do, the Gobiuses had a change of heart and decided they do want a child after all. Now the current apartment is inadequate, and they need to move to make room for the baby. Because they will have to move and purchase a new, larger house, they will be paying stamp duty a second time through no fault of their own, leaving less in the budget to spend on raising their child. Stamp duty is costly to changing your future plans. It taxes families for buying what they can, when they can, rather than providing the flexibility a modern life requires.
We tell stories to you guys today because we already know what you already know and what you will have heard time and time again throughout this inquiry, which is that the overwhelming evidence, research, and policy advice going back decades gives a resounding recommendation: abolish stamp duty. It's a bad tax. It's an inefficient tax. It reduces both the amount and the quality of housing supply, and it negatively impacts our fundamental goal of our organization of creating housing abundance. We recognize that the state government is operating today under a specific set of financial constraints. We understand those constraints. And while there have been suggestions that the government has ruled out stamp duty reform for residential property, like those of you here in this room, we're not quite sure it's so done and dusted. As the Parliamentary Budget Office noted in their submission to this inquiry, stamp duty is about 12.5% of state revenue. This is significant, for sure, but it's not insurmountable, and certainly not in the face of the overwhelming benefits that we would see. Creating a tax system that is fairer, more efficient, less distortionary, and ultimately more aligned with the lives and livelihoods of Victorians like those in the streets today, and future Victorians, people who would like to live here but currently cannot, or indeed aren't here yet. These are Victorians who, like all of us in YIMBY Melbourne, are living in the context of a housing crisis. Any barrier to increased supply, such as and including stamp duty, deeply affects these people and exacerbates this crisis. Our organisation has a mandate to advocate for housing abundance on behalf of all Melburnians, and the abolition of stamp duty is one small step toward the housing abundant city toward which we aspire. Thank you. That'll do for us.
Great. Thank you very much for that. We'll now go round from members with questions. Starting with Mr. Mulholland, we might do the usual 5 minutes and then go back around if there's time. Cool.
Thank you so much for your detailed submission, and congratulations on forming YIMBY Melbourne. I think it's an absolutely outstanding organisation who are already achieving quite a lot of success. Do you want to give us just a bit of background on your organisation, but similar organisations around the country that and successes you might have had? I recently saw the decision in Maribyrnong, so do you want to give us a bit of background on that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So YIMBY Melbourne obviously is sort of just a few months old in terms of the advocacy we've been doing in Melbourne. We've been sort of fronting up to council, having meetings with members and sort of bureaucrats for a few months now. And yeah, sort of started in February, and now we're here, and we're very much honoured to be here. Our membership sort of spans, yeah, as we said, sort of over a dozen councils. And most recently, our most significant media publicised win, I would say, was the overturn of the Maribyrnong Heritage Overlay, which would have locked up 800 blocks of land, sort of in perpetuity under a heritage overlay that would have made it incredibly difficult, not only for current homeowners to renovate their own homes, but also for potential future densification as Melbourne grows. At YIMBY Melbourne, we really believe that the city needs to grow up, not out. And these sort of overlays, which we oppose, we ultimately oppose things that make it more difficult to increase supply on land already in use rather than greenfield development. Now, we, of course, come in a legacy of other organizations. The YIMBY movement is international, sort of has its roots in the west coast of the United States, but hugely active organizations across particularly the UK. London has YIMBY Alliance, who advocate for various policies that are currently, I believe, sitting in the House of Lords over in London. And California YIMBY have also had a huge amount of wins in terms of enabling people to subdivide, build granny flats, all sorts of things that actually are very difficult to do here currently, and things that we would like to see more of, and which we will be detailing in future policy submissions. We come, of course, in the context of 2 years of very hard and excellent work from the Greater Canberra team. They're sort of the Canberra-based YIMBY organisation. Their campaign around Missing Middle, which sort of saw a huge coalition of organisations signing on to really support medium density housing in Canberra, which, while being hypothetically a very planned city, doesn't seem to have sort of had planning outcomes that have really benefited the people who live there and the people who would like to live there. They've recently sort of had their submission heavily endorsed by a similar inquiry into housing and rental affordability, looking at upzoning within Canberra, the likes of which we would like to see sort of throughout the upcoming planning reforms in Victoria. There's also Sydney YIMBY. They're a couple weeks behind us. We like to say we're a couple weeks ahead of the news cycle, and they're a couple weeks just behind us. But they are doing incredible work, similar work, advocacy around restrictions on supply, and they have an incredible member base who are doing incredible work.
I wanted to ask. I would be remiss to ask about housing, to not ask about, I guess, wedge in the housing debate that seems to have come up a lot in the news cycle on rent caps and rent freezes. We've seen recently the Treasurer appears to have cut a deal with the Greens in regards to an investigation into rental caps or forms of rental control here in Victoria. And I saw yesterday a Green senator quoted San Francisco as a great example of rental caps being used in practice. And I find this interesting because San Francisco rent policies have been specifically investigated by Stanford economists as the perfect example of the failure of rent caps. It found in the long run rent caps drove rents up, not down, and they led to a number of landlords converting their properties into other uses and actually diminished the available supply of rentals. What's your thoughts on a rental freeze or a rent cap? And do you think we should follow the housing policies of San Francisco?
Sure. So obviously the overwhelming economic evidence is that rent caps have a negative effect in the long term. One of the things that we really advocate for at YIMBY Melbourne is we are super interested in advocating for the people who want to live in a place but can't. Rent control, for the limited benefit it has, benefits the people who are already there. It benefits incumbents. Overwhelmingly, the research shows that it actually benefits wealthier people more than it benefits poorer people. And yes, San Francisco has been investigated thoroughly for the failure of this policy. But from our perspective, it's not just a numbers game. It's the fact that rent control locks people out of the city, people who would like to live in a place but can't.
You've spoken a lot about councils in particular, and activism is focused at a council blocking development at a local government level. I certainly see that in my electorate in places like Darebin and Marybeck and Yarra. Can you provide maybe a summary of how you'd like to see that process better managed?
Sure. There are a couple of things we would really love to see. We would love to see, at the very least, a standardization of processes across all councils. One of the things that has really shocked us as we've been organising is that we think we can send members to councils and kind of follow a process, but the reality is that different councils have different blockers, different meeting types, different meeting names, different processes for speaking at meetings. Sometimes they completely discourage speaking at all. A standardization of processes at a bare minimum. What we would also like to see, sort of as part of planning reform, is and sort of the reforms that we're going to see around housing over the sort of coming months and years, because of course these things take time to roll out meaningfully, is we would like to see more streamlined processes for developments being processed, particularly on a precinct-based level. Currently, Melbourne, and this comes down to the amount of land that's locked up in this city, it's very difficult to do well-planned developments because it's very difficult to develop on a precinct level. Oftentimes, developers have to buy up sort of individual plots or small plots, and then you sort of end up with these kind of taller buildings where there aren't any other taller buildings, which we don't necessarily see a problem with, but of course it generates community opposition. This is our planning system actually hamstringing good planning decisions. So we would love to see sort of incentives and rezoning that allows more precinct-based development, and whether that's intervention by minister or by what has been proposed previously or floated a long while ago is a sort of metropolitan authority that maybe takes control of planning. Especially for inner city Melbourne, sort of for the inner ring and inner city councils.
Cool. I think I'm.
Thanks, Mr. Mulholland. Ms. Copsey?
Thank you. Thanks so much for your submission and for appearing for the committee today. I was interested to delve into, obviously, I've read your support for the abolition of stamp duty and transition to a broad-based land tax, and wondered if you had a view on the methods of transition. In particular, you've cited the ACT, and I was wondering if you have a view on faster or slower periods of transition, and what the YIMBY movement would argue for in that case.
Don, would you like to?
So my understanding is that the ACT's transition is probably slower than it needed to be. That's based on what the Grattan Institute has said. I think they've said that a 10-year transition, if you were going to do a sort of phase out of stamp duty and a phase in of land tax, that sort of 10-year period would be sufficient for that. But there are other models that let you change faster, so you can sort of just switch immediately and then sort of provide a credit for stamp duty that has been paid in the recent past. Yeah, we're not necessarily experts in tax policy, and so we'd sort of defer to other submissions like those by Grattan and the Parliamentary Budget Office that have got a lot more detail about those sort of possible transition models.
Great.
To add to that, it's also about political appetite and the reality of the current Victorian government's budget. We're working within these constraints. We recognise that there's appetite for revenue neutral solutions. We also recognise that it's relatively difficult without federal assistance to have a revenue neutral solution to stamp duty. It would probably require some sort of additional investment into housing from the federal government on a state-by-state basis. Potentially, you could build a system, for instance, which we've spoken about a little bit, where maybe the federal government subsidizes sort of losses on this transition by also incentivizing housing targets being met by states. You could build systems like that to keep it revenue neutral if it needs to be, but otherwise, ultimately, it's more a question of political will and financial realities than it is about the nitty-gritty, and yeah, we would defer to Grattan.
Great. And you just touched on, that was my next question, the option for a credit. A credit deferral mechanism is something that you also see as attractive based on the other submissions that you reviewed? Yep.
It could be, yeah. There are a few models that would be reasonable to do.
Part of what we've got is it's again trade-offs. People are going to see it as unfair. We sort of flagged in our opening statement the kind of idea of the grandmother tax. Land tax would act as a new tax. However, you can build in certain income-based or equity-based exemptions on that stamp duty. You can also build out, as you were saying, Don, different timelines. Again, on the credit. You can annuitize it to 10 years, 5 years, just people who bought in the last 2 years. It depends how large the stamp tax, the land tax is, at what percentage it's set at. Obviously, we make no calls on what that number is. We don't even necessarily make a call on the exact method of calculating the value of land. Of course, there are many methods, multiple of which are used in Victoria alone. So it would depend on all of that.
Great, thank you. And my last question, I was mainly interested in your views on transition mechanisms, were that explored, but being a relatively new organisation, and I congratulate you on the organising you're doing locally, can you give the panel an insight into the size of your membership now, since you've begun?
Sure. We're sitting at 30 members. We're about to transition over into a paid membership model. Our mailing list exceeds 500.
Excellent, thank you. That's my questions.
Thanks, Ms. Copsey. Mr. Berger.
Chair, I don't have any questions at this point.
Cool. Mr. Davis.
I do have some questions. There's a few different questions I'd like to ask. The first is a lot of attack has gone on to councils and their behaviour with planning.
Yep.
But I would argue, and many in the development industry would argue, that one of the big problems is actually the department and the minister's office. Planning applications that sit on the minister's desk for a year or 2 or 3. Do you support cleaning up that process to make sure that there's sharp timelines?
We think that there has been initially, and from us, purposefully, a focus on councils. We started off local. Obviously, we've been building out this policy arm and, made this submission, and thank you very much again for having us here. The reality is that the entire system needs to be cleaned up. It's not just councils, absolutely. And the deeper we get into this wicked problem that is the housing crisis, the more we find that it's about the fact that there is a web of policies, departments, processes that can all point to each other in terms of why there are delays. The reality is there does need to be streamlining. There needs to be streamlining at most levels. I would not support necessarily out of the blue any given model. Certainly, I understand that a bit of our membership have concerns about, for instance, centralisation under the Minister's office. You don't necessarily want to centralise the entire state's planning in one place.
Especially if you had a slow minister. No, I'm deadly serious.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
deadly
and-
serious.
yeah.
Some applications lie on the minister's desk for years at a time.
I can't comment on that, but I will take your word for it. And
Very diplomatic.
Well, no, seriously, go and talk to the
I
development industry and ask.
I believe you.
I mean, if you're going to clean it up, you've got to clean up. It's no use kicking the thing upstairs, but it still sits on the minister's desk for a couple of years or more, as has happened particularly with the last minister, bar one. And then even the last minister had a whole set of conflicts of interest that stopped her authorising planning permits. But I think it's squarely a matter. If you're bringing stuff to market, you actually want to have not hurdles.
I fully support. I fully support state reform as well as
good.
local.
And let me pick a big piece of land, for example, Commonwealth land. The Commonwealth owns a truckload of land in metropolitan Melbourne and across Victoria. Let's pick the biggest site, the Maribyrnong Defence site that was occupied by the Commonwealth for the best part of a century. It's land that is right near transport. It's actually right near shopping centres. It's right near schools. It's a huge tract of land that has been polluted by the Commonwealth. Would you support bringing land like that to market?
How polluted is it?
Well, the question is, would the Commonwealth clean it up first, isn't it?
Sure. I think the reality is that land is locked up for all sorts of reasons. I think land that is not being utilised should be utilised.
So in
and there should be-
principle, Commonwealth land that could be brought forward should be brought forward?
Land in the inner city, yes. Commonwealth land in the inner city.
Or
I'm not going to
middle
comment.
suburbs.
Yeah, I'm not going to comment, for instance, on like Commonwealth parks and so
You're
on.
welcome to take the
appropriate.
question.
No,
If
but
you
there's
don't know right now.
but I'm interested if you've examined this side of it. And then there's also state land. There's significant tracts of state government land. Do you support those being brought to market too?
Yes, we're much more sort of across state policy and state land. In that case, the state government releases a certain amount of land every year, is my understanding. It could be done at a faster rate.
Well, it releases land on the edge of the city through planning instruments, but I'm talking about state government-owned land. They're sitting on various pieces of land across the state that could be brought forward. Do you support those sorts of steps?
If you'd like to take that on notice, you're more than welcome to.
I think we'll take it on notice. Thank you.
And I had another question, just with respect to older people who may exist and need their home. There are other interventions other than state policy too. So, for example, the Commonwealth, through its asset tests and so forth, discourages people from selling the family home. So do you support some change there? Is that what you're recommending too?
We're squarely focused on state policy at the moment. However, there are clear distortions and clear problems with the fact that your home is not included in the same way in terms of your equity, your amount of assets, and your asset test for things like the pension. You know, there are people who are sitting on houses that are worth sort of millions and millions of dollars and receiving sort of a full pension on top of that. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense, but the exact model of how you would reform that, we would defer to people with more expertise.
Sorry, Mr.
all right,
Davis,
I'll
we'll have to come back to you. I have a question for you. I've read your submission and understand what your broader view is in terms of abolishing stamp duty and replacing it with a broad-based land tax. Do you have a view on the current concession system that exists in Victoria for stamp duty, or improvements that could be made for it?
In terms of the concessions around, for instance,
Yeah, are
first-time buyers
they
and so on.
appropriate? Is there, are they large enough? Is there more that should be done?
I think we would focus more on the abolition of stamp duty
okay.
rather than exactly how much demand should be subsidized. Ultimately, subsidizing demand doesn't work. It's a spiral. It's expensive. You're spending a lot of money. The reality is that if we subsidize people's stamp duty and then we don't tax them in any way, you're actually creating holes in the budget that way also. There are huge problems that subsidizing demand brings up. We need supply side solutions.
And you also say in your submission that stamp duty isn't the only factor driving shortage of housing in Victoria. What are your views on what else can be done to increase supply?
Sure. One of the big things that can be done to meaningfully increase supply is a change in our zoning codes, mass upzoning of the inner city. In so much of Melbourne, within a kilometre of this building, you are only legally allowed to build up to 2 stories. It doesn't make a huge amount of sense for our inner city to contain so many sort of single-family homes, be they terrace homes, be they detached houses. Part of the reality of a city is that it has to grow, and we can grow it out, which is environmentally, financially, and productivity-wise very costly. Or we can build up. We can actually embrace change within the inner city. We can see housing being built not only in numbers, but in terms of numbers where people want to live, right? We can keep building further and further out, and we can build suburbias with no infrastructure, or where infrastructure is very expensive, where people's lifestyles end up heavily subsidized via the construction of roads and highways and so on. Or we can increase the number of people who are using the infrastructure that already has capacity and that can be more easily expanded by upzoning in the inner city. And that is what we would broadly focus on in terms of increasing supply.
Thank Thank you. Mr Limbrick?
Thank you. And thank you for your submission. And I'm also very interested in what you're doing here. I think the first time that I came across anything to do, or the word YIMBY, was in 2019 during the nuclear prohibition inquiry when YIMBYs were advocating for nuclear power plants.
Heroes.
Yeah, they were very good. But housing's very different.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend living in a nuclear power plant, but
The next door to one. Yeah.
next to one is fine. Next to one is fine.
Yeah, don't get me started. Yeah. But one of the arguments, and this is less of an economic or revenue argument, more of a moral argument, is, and you brought up the issue before with older people.
Sure.
These people have been planning for their retirement for a long time, and the idea of imposing some new tax on them when they're probably not earning an income anymore, other than what they've planned for in their retirement through their savings or pension or whatever it is. What do you think about the idea of exempting existing property owners from this land tax and just bringing it forward for new purchases? And that would remove this issue around older people who want to stay in their home. And as has been already brought up, and DTF actually said this when we brought up the issue of older people not moving, they actually said that the larger incentive, much larger incentive than stamp duty, was actually due to the assets test for pensions. It was a much larger disincentive to moving than stamp duty.
Yeah, of course, because it's advantageous to keep the house.
Yeah, so what do you think around those sort of mechanisms to manage equity for people who've been planning for their retirement for a long time and not be stung with something, when later in life when their capacity to earn money is much diminished?
We're certainly not going to give exact numbers, but I think it would be fair to say that there is a level of equity, especially with how house prices have sort of grown over the last sort of 3 decades or so. There's a level of equity that you can have in a home where actually maybe a land tax isn't going to break the bank. Equally, there are older people who are not, have not had the fortune of buying into the market at the right time, or the fortune of sort of, dual incomes their whole lives. There are a lot of reasons why someone might not have the level of equity where it would be reasonable to tax. We're not going to draw exact numbers. I feel that in principle, I think it is okay to bring a tax in on high levels of equity, especially when we have sort of this generational wealth inequality. The reality is that land tax is an efficient way of kind of redistributing wealth in that way, without kind of the distortions that we're seeing from stamp duty. And it's still, you would also need to obviously do some sort of reform in terms of the asset test. We're not going to comment on that here. It's slightly outside of our scope of expertise. But ultimately, we don't necessarily see a moral problem with taxing large amounts of equity, especially when we're not taxing the equity, we're taxing the underlying land that is being used by that equity. And the only reason we're having this discussion is because of the distortions around the asset test. So I would defer to the asset test and reform around that. I don't think we have a moral position there.
No, the other thing I'd add is that the land tax is most effective when it's broad-based, and the slower you make that transition, the longer you delay the benefits of it. And so transitioning all housing over to a land tax and then just offering the ability to defer payment of the land tax might be an option. So wait until the house sells and then you can pay the land tax if you don't have any income. But you need to... we need to consider how these tax reforms affect everyone. And while that sort of change would help those people, those households that are sort of asset-rich, income-poor, the current regime isn't working for younger people. And so making the switch is really, on the whole, it's definitely worthwhile.
Yeah, and the reality is that asset-rich and income-poor is still asset-rich.
And another thing which I know you guys are very much aware of is this intersection, and we've already discussed it, between planning and tax, because if you don't open up areas for development, then you can't get this if there was a new broad-based land tax, it wouldn't exist because the houses aren't built yet, right?
Yep.
So it's not just stamp duty hindering development and labour mobility, it's also planning. And I know that Maribyrnong Council had that overlay, they decided to go against it. And I know in the last term of Parliament, the government tried to put a heritage overlay on the Eastern Freeway, which we thought was hilarious at the time. But how much significance do you think that these heritage overlays are having on hindering development and new housing?
The reality is that more of Melbourne is under heritage overlay than a city like New York. We have a city that is astronomically locked up. Now it's locked up under other things that we've flagged here today. Of course, zoning is bigger, perhaps, than heritage. The thing that we argue about with heritage is that it is an additional blocker. And these decisions are made in sort of a black box, predominantly by the Heritage Council and sort of heritage consultants who obviously have a financial interest in passing heritage overlays. We see them as a very basic target that I think a lot of people can get on side with. It is a delimiter, but a lot of the land and a lot of the properties that are heritage overlaid are also under restrictive zoning. It's another barrier. It is not the only barrier.
And the other thing I'd say is that heritage overlays a lot of them are in the inner cities, which is where people most want to live, and where there's the most demand for the biggest increases in density that could happen.
Some people have, and I probably share this view, they see heritage overlays as just people who don't own property exerting property rights on other people's property. What do you say about the idea that the heritage value of a particular house should be decided by the owner of the house?
One of the great quotes that I think came out of Maribyrnong was from Mayor Carter. And she was quoting a citizen who had written into her around the overlay, who said, "Trust us to know our own houses the best." Heritage overlays, heritage consultants make decisions for a variety of complicated reasons. It's not always aesthetic. It sometimes has to do with methods of construction. It sometimes has to do with materials. It sometimes has to do with things that literally are not visible from the street. We would say that ultimately the decisions are made not in the overall benefit of citizens of Melbourne, current or future, but are made purely around heritage and therefore need to be more heavily scrutinised.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Limbrick. Mrs. MacArthur.
Thank you very much, Chair. And what a refreshing pair of young people. But a bit of political advice: drop the grandmother tax. I think you can win the argument on that. It's wonderful to see an alternative to NIMBYs, the bane of my life. But look, there's a whole lot of things I want to raise with you. I come from the class of I don't want to give governments any more money because they don't spend it wisely now. So what about, I totally agree with abolishing stamp duty, but why another tax? Why don't we argue that governments should spend money more wisely and therefore they wouldn't even need a property tax?
We might take that question mostly on notice.
Develop a thesis around that. You did say that you come from the view that how tax reform affects everyone. Now, I'm from a rural electorate where currently councils have ramped up the rates on the farming community, sometimes to the point of 45% increase in their rates, even though they can still keep under the rate cap because of the increase in land values, or so-called increase in land values, because of course it's done by somebody probably sitting in Fitzroy on a spreadsheet. No longer do we have land values go out and actually walk on the ground. And therefore, a property tax based on land values is going to impact seriously farmers who frequently don't turn over property frequently, like maybe somebody who needs to change a house in Melbourne. So how would you argue, if it's a tax reform that's got to affect everyone or be fair to everyone, how are you going to argue it's a good thing for those creating wealth and food in the country areas, but have no control over price or output?
Sure. We're obviously mostly focused on the inner city and purely residential housing. Of course, agricultural land, I believe, is sort of considered under a whole bunch of other different rules.
Give a government an inch, they'll take a mile.
Maybe that is the rule. I haven't checked. What we would say is that those considerations would need to be made based on how productive we'd like that industry to be. We obviously don't want to punish people, but what we're focused on is residential housing and the benefits that stamp duty has in terms of ensuring turnover of supply and more efficiency in terms of people being able to move. Agricultural land is not our expertise. We would defer to, hopefully, other experts who you've had come and speak at this inquiry.
Well, everybody seems to be focusing on housing in inner city areas or outside. I totally agree with you. We should go up and not out, because I don't want to see good agricultural land turned into houses because we need to feed people in the most productive way. So I support you on that. Also, I agree with you on subsidisation is not a solution. Certainly the churning of the dollar by the time we take from one hand and give on another with a homeowner's grant or some sort of exemption is, I would have thought, totally unproductive. I also agree with you on the Heritage Council. Now, I actually think they should stick to their knitting in what they're really meant to be doing, and I can quote you an example in Ballarat where they should have stopped the Ballarat City Council putting outrageous lights around a iconic lake, but they went along with it. And I think you probably want to look into how political they are, not what they're doing in relation to heritage. I think, would you say that if we are to have reform in tax, that would be better perhaps to broaden the base of the GST and do away with these state taxes?
The centralisation of GST, we have sort of considered it. It's been kind of a problem for state governments because it gives them less control over their own budget. Part of the advantage of something like a land tax is that it gives reliable, regular income. The stamp duty currently, and we haven't touched on this at all yet, but I'm sure many have, it relies on the cycles of the property market, which is a very cyclical market. Land tax
is going to rely on that too.
No, not necessarily, because it relies on a base of land, which is a constant. Yes, the value of land may fluctuate slightly, but it doesn't fluctuate hugely. It certainly doesn't fluctuate like housing prices. And it doesn't fluctuate based on people's appetite to buy or sell. The supply of land is always the same. And you can predict much better than housing prices what that price will be.
So you're going to take away the value of a house and just value the land?
Well, that's how a land tax would function, yeah. So it would be on the unimproved value of the land. So the location of the land.
Who's going to do that?
I believe there are already land valuation authorities in Victoria who undertake this process. It may be an expansion of their responsibilities.
Thank you, Mrs. McArthur. We have time for one more question from each member. Mr. Mulholland.
What about Mr.
Sorry, Mr. McIntosh has technical issues and can. You're here. No, I got the update before that he would not be able to ask a question. Tom, do you want to ask a question? Put your hand up if you do, and we'll try to sort you out.
We can't hear him.
We can't hear you. We'll try to sort you out. I'll go to Mr. Mulholland in the meantime.
Cool. I just wanted to ask you guys about housing targets. I know respected economist Peter Tulip has done some great work on this, talking about housing targets and kind of wanting to help both government and councils meet those targets in a more streamlined manner so that councils can better prioritise, what to object to and what to approve. I look at my own electorate where the minister's just approved a Nightingale development with a heritage substation, electrical substation in it, but there's really ones that councils consider much more important to people, like say Preston Market, for example. They might be able to prioritise that, but not go opposing every single other development as well. What's your view on the housing targets model?
you want to go or I can go? All right. It's kind of been touched on a little bit today, the idea that there's the potential for federal involvement here. We obviously have 3 tiers of government, and each can sort of incentivize each other. Housing targets are a necessary, I would say, a necessary condition of funding, powers, what have you. I think it is essential in a housing crisis, but also with housing being, even if we weren't in a crisis, housing is an essential good. It is something that everyone needs, and there is a responsibility for all levels of government to meet that need. I think targets, incentives, carrots around adequate construction, adequate net increase in supply, not just sort of knocking down 2 houses and building 1 larger house or what have you, actual meaningful increases in supply is going to absolutely be key in terms of ensuring that we not only have short-term growth in housing supply, but kind of a continued growth mindset and abundance mindset around something as essential as housing.
Thanks, Mr. Mulholland. Mr. Davis?
So just coming back to the granny tax.
Yep.
Has your
David, drop that
organisation no, has your organisation considered the harshness that might impact, the impact that it might have? So older people who have lived in one place for their life,
Yep.
and you want to slug them with a land tax, I think that could have a series of very serious consequences for some people. You've pointed out that some of them are asset rich, but income poor, so they may be forced out of their home. Is effectively, let's call it for what it is. You're going to drive them out of their home.
I don't think that would be the case under a land tax. I think what we would see is, through the ease of movement, we would see more people moving house. We would also see people potentially taking, let me reframe. The reality is that we can still asset test in terms of who's paying the land tax. How much equity do you have in your land? Especially when we are grandfathering in. Is grandfathering okay? When we're grandfathering people into it. Grandparenting someone into a system, thank you. There need to be considerations.
People parenting.
We need to be when we're grandparenting people into a system, we need to consider where they are at before that system is brought into effect. I think there would need to be measures to ensure that people aren't driven out of their homes, but there also needs to be a recognition that, as Don said, a land tax is most effective when it is broad-based. We need to tax land broadly to ensure that all land, a scarce resource, is used as effectively as possible by our population.
And the follow-up question just picks up from Mrs. MacArthur's earlier point.
We need to be quick, Mr. Davis.
Yep. We could end up with the problem we've got in Canberra, where they said they'd move away from the stamp duty, but now we have both. And we could have just ended up with both.
We wouldn't want to see us end up with both. There have been a lot of models. There's obviously been the proposed Paratet model in New South Wales that got
ditched.
Well, that got rolled back. There are models where existing homeowners don't pay land tax, but new purchasers do.
The only one in Australia that we have that's been tried is in Canberra, where they stopped halfway. They're not following through in the rate they said. We've got the land tax, and we've still got a very high stamp duty too.
Sure.
So we've got the double.
We might have to
double.
We might have to wrap up that questioning there and go to Mr. Limbrick. We have
Their model is definitely very slow transition, and there are other models that allow you to transition
But
much
they're not even
faster.
sticking to their transition pace. They're actually
Davis?
We're not going to comment on the political will of the Legislative Council of ACT.
Thanks. We have 4.5 minutes, and I want to make sure everyone gets a last question in. Mr. Limbrick.
Thank you. One of the really interesting things about your organisation is I see this is part of a cultural shift in some ways.
Absolutely.
Like some of these problems that we've had with NIMBYism and stuff like that is really a cultural problem. What's the view of, how do you see yourselves in terms of leading that cultural shift? I know that you've already done some good work in going to councils and that sort of thing, but how do you see this playing out in the wider community?
Sure, there's a huge shift at the moment. One of the biggest demographic shifts that we're seeing is not anything to do with sort of individual characteristics. It's to do with a growing proportion of people renting. especially young people. Young people are thinking about housing. There is the old adage of the Australian dream that, you want to own a house. We're not necessarily sure that the way in which one sort of has access to housing, I believe it's called the tenure of housing. We don't necessarily have an opinion on what is best, but what we do know is that people need to feel secure where they live. And the reality is that many renters in an asymmetrical market, a market where landlords have outsized power due to housing scarcity, people feel disenfranchised, they feel insecure. People feel like they might have to move every 6 months. They feel like their rent, their rental is maybe going to go back on the market and then going to have to move a long way away because there's a shortage of housing in their suburb. They got the one unit that was within their price point in Brunswick. And if that closes, they might have to move suburbs. They'll move out of their communities. People feel insecure in where they live. And when people don't have that fundamental basis, particularly young people, there's a level of anxiety. And I think that what the YIMBY movement kind of does and has done across the world, across Australia and now here in Melbourne, is provide a positive view of a city that can grow, a positive view of a city that can provide for everyone, that can build up, not out, and that can fundamentally provide housing for all who want it, where they want to live, and in a way that does not leave them rent-stressed, disadvantaged, or overall disenfranchised by a system that has sort of left them feeling locked out and disillusioned. And that's a political reality that I think every elected representative is taking more and more into account as they consider voters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mrs. McArthur, do you have another question? And if so, I ask that we keep it brief because we have
Very good. Well, first of all, fantastic that you're ruling out rent capping. That's great. Just keep on that. Brett, what's your view on school zoning, which seems to totally distort the housing market?
Good question.
School zoning is interesting. My father is a school principal, so I think about this a bit. We're not going to comment on it because it is outside of the scope of our policy understandings, but we take that on notice.
Okay, Nadia?
Yes, unless you have a 30-second follow-up question.
No.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming along today and sharing your views and for your very fulsome submission. That concludes the public hearing, and all broadcast and Hansard equipment can now be turned off.